Hi, thank you all for coming out today. My name is Andrew, and I'm an attendee of the Georgetown branch of the Platypus Affiliate Society. Platypus organizes public fora and teach-ins as well as reading groups on topics concerning the history and the modern left. We host our reading group every week on Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. in New North 202, as well as coffee breaks in the ICC foyer on Fridays at 5 p.m. You can find us online at Instagram and on Facebook. Just look up Platypus Georgetown. And yeah, I'll hand it over to Max, who will be pedagoguing.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just be moderating the panel today. To my left, we have Benjamin Studebaker. Benjamin Studebaker has a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. He's the author of two books, The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. To his left is Daniel Tutt. Tutt is a philosopher of Marxism and psychoanalysis. He's taught philosophy at George Washington University, the Washington, D.C. Jail, and Marymount University. Tutt is the host of the Emancipations podcast. He founded study groups on psychoanalysis and politics. He's a co-editor with Matt Sharp of the forthcoming special issue on Lukács's The Destruction of Reason with Historical Materialism, which will be published in 2026. Daniel's first book is entitled Psychoanalysis and the Politics of the Family. His most recent book is How to Read Like a Parasite, Why the Left Got High on Nietzsche. To his left is Spencer Leonard. Spencer is a historian of India and the editor of Marx and Engels on Bonapartism and Imperialism, Selected Journalism. He's also a professor of sociology at James Madison University and a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. Unfortunately, Mike Golash cannot be here today, so in his place, Ross McCarthy is here representing the Progressive Labor Party. The topic of the panel is imperialism. What is it and why should we be against it? On various fronts, such as Ukraine, Palestine, and China, the left invokes the rallying cry of imperialism to oppose or support the actions of various state powers. In the past few months, this cry has been further raised in response to Trump's proposed annexations of Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada to the United States. Such a cry may evoke disparate historical memories of the left, including the protests against the 2000s War on Terror, NATO intervention in Bosnia, the Falklands War, the Vietnam War, and World War I, which Marxists called the Imperialist War. Understanding what, if anything, these historical moments have in common raises the need to clarify this category of imperialism. With that, I will hand it off to our first speaker, Benjamin Studebaker.
All right. Imperialism comes from the Latin imperium. The Roman Empire is the Imperium Romanorum. It refers to the domain of the Romans, the area of the world that is subject to them. The ism suffix was first attached in the 19th century. It implies further beliefs or an intricate system. An imperialist is not simply one who has an empire, but one who thinks like an empire haver. Imperialism is not just an imperium, but a system of imperia. Since 395 AD, there have been a plurality of empires in the West. But it wasn't until the 19th century that this plurality came to be regarded as a system in English. What does it mean to have an empire? One who has an empire has dominion over someplace else. The empire is other in the sense that it is not our home, but it is ours in that we are its masters. So to think like an empire haver is to think of oneself as having dominion over some other place, or as participating in the domination of such a place. Empires get going because as we explore the world, we run into strange people we aren't sure what to do with. We don't know how to work with them, and they don't know how to work with us. This leads to intractable disagreements about how to do business together. These disagreements are often difficult to work through because of conflicts of interest, language barriers, and religious differences. It's easier and less costly to impose order through violence. So, to make peace, the hostile parties make war. There are many ways this can happen. An army from one place might travel to another place and conquer it. Settlers from one place might move to another place, colonizing it. Or perhaps by making certain kinds of economic decisions, raising tariffs, selling bonds, or imposing sanctions, people in one place can compel people in some other place to change their form of life. But imperialism is not just empire, it's an ism. And as an ism, it cannot be reduced to the mere projection of power into other parts of the world. It is not enough to have an empire. You have to think like an empire haver, and you have to participate in a system of empires. To think like an empire haver, you have to think of the empire as a place that you dominate from outside. An imperialist cannot regard the empire as their home. They cannot regard the imperial subjects as fellow citizens. Once you regard the empire as something you share in common with the other people who live in it, you don't think of yourself as having dominion over them. You think of yourself as sharing in a common world. This common thing, this res publica, creates a civil bond between you and the people who were formerly your subjects. They cease to be subjects, they cease to be slaves, they become your fellow citizens. And this happens not against your will, but with recognition and assent from you. The thing is, this doesn't happen very easily anymore. Many people insist that they are empire havers. They aren't able to think of people living in other parts of the world as sharing in a common thing with them. They're only able to regard these people as subjects. You might think I'm talking about the race realists on the right, who deny that we can have civil relations with people of different ethnic backgrounds. I wish they were our only problem. Truly, it would make things much easier. But today, most of the imperialists are on the left. Now, it's true that the left doesn't like the empire. It hates having an empire. It wishes we didn't have one. But it still believes we do. And in believing we have an empire, it adopts an attitude of empire having. It doesn't think of people who live in other parts of the world as being in civil or social relations with us. Instead, it thinks of them as our subjects, as our slaves. It fetishizes them as a subaltern and dreams that we will one day face a slave revolt. It holds that people, on the basis of ethnicity or genetics, are indigenous to particular places, as if humanity were composed of a variety of species of plants. In taking these positions, the left dehumanizes people who live in other parts of the world. It strips them of their capacity to share the world with us. There are other ways to think about the people who live in other parts of the world. They are trade partners. They are allies. In socialism, they would have joined us in a federal union of republics. Ah, yes, socialism. Let's talk about that. For Lenin, the imperialist attitude motivated the capitalist states to solve their economic problems by establishing a system of domination in Africa and Asia. By holding dominion in these places, they could compel subject populations to participate in trade on terms that served the interests of the European powers. They could be made to supply raw materials, and they could be made to purchase goods and services. This worked not just because the Europeans established a system of empires, but because they regarded themselves as having them. They felt they could impose terms on the populations in these countries by force. But the Europeans did not create just one empire. They created a system of empires. These empires cooperated with each other, but they also competed with each other. To continue growing their economies, they needed resources and markets belonging to one another. So they began struggling to take each other's empires. In this way, the system of imperialism contradicted itself. As it spread capitalism throughout the world, it also generated interstate competition, culminating in World War. For Lenin, this interstate competition created an opportunity for socialists. A world war among imperialists required enormous numbers of soldiers and shells. The workers who made the shells and who ran from trench to trench in heavy gunfire could refuse to do these things. And if they did, they could establish a new kind of republic. This new republic would transform the relationship between the Europeans and the people living in Africa and Asia. Instead of one dominating the other, they would establish a common world. Socialism required a federal union of republics. This is often referred to as an internationalist project, but that language often leads us to miss some of what it involves. This was not merely an attempt to create some internationalist institutions like the United Nations or the International Monetary Fund. It was an attempt to create a political union, a federal republic. That federal republic would empower the workers of the world to govern capital. It would subordinate capital to those that labored to produce it. Instead of a system of empires, there would be one federal union. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was instituted to be this polity, but it was unable to federate with enough people in enough places. Its revolution stalled out. It was forced to pursue socialism in just one country. But if socialism is established in just one country, how does that one country relate to the rest? When the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union came into possession of the countries of Eastern Europe, but it did not regard those countries as sharers in a common world. East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania were not brought into the Soviet Union as socialist republics. At best, they were treated as allied states. At worst, they were treated as an empire belonging to the Soviet Union. The line between an ally and an imperial subject is thin, and in tough times, it is easily crossed. It was for this reason that in 91 BC, the cities of Italy made war upon Rome. These allies of Rome, the socii, knew that as long as they remained allies, they could be treated as imperial subjects. Roman magistrates regularly encroached upon their lands, redistributing their property to Roman citizens. To achieve fair terms of cooperation, the Italians needed to be more than allies. They needed to be Romans. They needed the Romans to recognize them as part of the res publica. They struggled for 4 years and won their war by losing it. They were defeated militarily, but they were recognized as citizens. Today, the left has forgotten this possibility. It treats political and economic integration as forms of domination, recognizing no distinction between civil relations, social relations, and slavery. It therefore sees empire everywhere. It insists that we view ourselves as empire havers, and it doesn't stop at international politics. We are told that families, workplaces, and political and social organizations are dominated by straight, white, cis-het males. The possibility that these systems could produce good relationships, however flawed, is never emphasized. If every kind of relationship is always already one of domination, then there can be no emancipatory relations. Freedom is reduced merely to independence, to the capacity to persist in splendid isolation. If you can own your own home, if you can live alone and work remote, then you have achieved as much freedom as the left can now envision. What then is the function of raising imperialism today? It functions as a disciplinary stick. If you start thinking too much or too hard about how people could live together better with people in other parts of the world, you're accused of trying to dominate those people in those places. You're told that there are essentially distinct peoples, each of which has a right of national self-determination, and for this reason you can't say anything at all about what they should do. You have to recognize the ways in which they are different from you, and you have to listen to their voices, which are never in part yours. You can't have a dialogue with them, because to try to speak to them as partners implies a failure to recognize yourself as a privileged empire haver. You must approach them as an imperialist, and so your first and only duty is to apologize for the dominion you have always exercised and will always exercise. This way of thinking just perpetuates bad relationships. It doesn't improve anything for anyone. China has grown and developed because it agreed to trade and ally with the United States. Its future depends on its ability to maintain social relations with this country. If we think socialism has to come to the richest and most advanced capitalist states, then socialism requires that people in these states be willing to cooperate with people in poorer, less developed states. It requires cooperation between people in the United States and people in China. What happens if we instead destroy social relations between these two countries and generate hostile interstate competition? That will lead to imperialist war. For Lenin, imperialist war could be useful because it created an opportunity for workers to take state power by refusing to serve in the army or to make the shells. But we no longer live in the era of mass mobilization armies. We live in the era of drones, millions of them. It is not at all obvious that an imperialist war presents any kind of opportunity for socialists. When imperialist wars don't produce socialism, they produce barbarism and regression. The failure of the Bolshevik Revolution to produce a federal union of socialist republics that included the richest and most powerful capitalist states led to a century of interstate rivalry, great power war, and millions upon millions of unnecessary deaths. We should not wait for such a thing, nor should we encourage such a catastrophe by taking sides, by cheering for either the masters or the slaves. If there must be a war for socialism, imperialist war is the wrong sort of war. A social war, a war among allies that ends in the recognition of those allies as citizens of a common world, would be better. But if we could have socialism without war, if we could make decisions together proactively without waiting for an emergency to force our hands in ways we don't fully understand, that would be best. Now, before I wrap up, I want to briefly raise one last little thing. In the imperial period, the Romans do not regard the res publica as having ceased to exist. Rather, one citizen, the princeps, the first citizen, holds imperium over all others, leaving no other citizen in possession of it. It's in this sense that the princeps is also imperator. But the imperator is not alienated from the citizens as a king, as a rex. Rather, his imperium depends upon consensus et concordia, an agreement among the citizens that he is first among them. If this agreement breaks down, then there is a war among the citizens, a civil war, to determine which of them is first. In that civil war, the unity of the res publica remains a given. In this sense, the United States has never had a civil war. What we call the Civil War was really something else, a revolution. That revolution was no slave revolt. It was a struggle to create a new res publica while preserving the unity of the old. Those who think revolution requires that the res publica be dissolved, that the conservative territories be given independence, or that their residents be treated as distinct peoples in need of national liberation, are in a very precise, meaningful, old Latin sense, traditores. They are those who would hand over the territory of the res publica. For the Romans, they are to be regarded as in league with the barbarians. I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And I'll end it there.
Okay. Thank you very much. Title of my talk is An Anti-Imperialism of Fools, Revisiting the Roots of Chauvinism, Revisionism, and Opportunism. In his text on Lenin, entitled Lenin, A Study on the Unity of His Thought, Georgy Lukács argues that Lenin incorporated an entirely new element into the tradition of historical materialism, precisely in his analysis of imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. Why? Well, it is because Lenin showed the way that the different currents within the working class movement function and how they relate to opportunism, chauvinism, and to revisionism. In other words, in Lukács' account, Lenin not only offers a means to seize the opportunity that imperialism opens for the proletarian revolution, but Lenin also provides the most important method by which Marxists can discern theoretical clarity in the face of imperialism. Lenin's genius is thus that he allows us as Marxists to take a decisive action in the class struggle at the moment in which capitalism enters its imperialist stage. Lenin shows the ways that chauvinism, revisionism, and opportunism all become extremely ripe during imperialist times. What were the roots of chauvinism according to Lenin? The reason I ask this question is because we must remember that Lenin did not possess a moral critique of chauvinism. The accusation of chauvinism today often seems to be highly confused and based on what I would call a kind of liberal common good sense. It is taken as a stand-in for some type of moral error, for racism, bigotry, or for an improper exclusion of the oppressed of the global South. Such a framework, I would argue, is foreign to Lenin. Lenin argued that to be chauvinist is to be outside of Marxism. Chauvinism for Lenin, therefore, has to be understood as an effect of opportunism, and opportunism starts when the proletariat has become bourgeois, or when the proletariat has become bound up with bourgeois interests. Thus, the problem with both opportunism and chauvinism is strategic for Lenin. When a Marxist adopts either position, they adopt a faulty perspective on the nature of the class struggle itself. This perspective leads workers, this is the main problem with it, it leads workers to see their exploitation as normal, to ignore it. That is the meaning of workers becoming bourgeois, to ignore their own exploitation. This is something that Engels saw before the age of imperialism in his early text, before he met Marx, called The Condition of the Working Class in England. In his 1916 pamphlet, which I have right here, called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin will argue that Kautsky fell sway to chauvinism. And this was due to Kautsky's faulty reading of the global situation of imperialism. While Kautsky was critical of monopoly capitalism, he embraced a theory of what he called ultra-imperialism that supported free trade and thus advocated a better pre-monopoly form of capitalism. Ultra-imperialism therefore refers to a type of network and alliance of inter-imperialist control, and this is the root of Kautsky's own chauvinism. It's tied into his interpretation, as well as the practical effects of his interpretation, on the class struggle and the direction of the class struggle. Kautsky was not adequately revolutionary in the face of imperialism, according to Lenin. He advocated what he called peaceful democracy, and this culminated, paradoxically, in his vote in support of war credits on the cusp of World War I. So we should ask, what is imperialism for Lenin? Well, it is synonymous with a stage of capitalism that is called monopoly capitalism, and it entails three general features. The first is the concentration of monopoly in the field of production. The second is concentration of monopoly in the financial sector of banks at a global level. And the third is colonial land acquisition, which leads to war and conflict. Okay. In this situation, the primary contradiction becomes between capitalism as construed as an honest free trade system versus capitalism as construed as a gangster cartel monopoly. Kautsky refused to see capitalism along this contradiction. He argued that ultra-imperialism is ultimately not so bad. Ultra-imperialism is kind of like a federated Christendom that could ensure peace. Kautsky's chauvinism is thus not a moral failing, and nor is it a moral failing of social democracy, who sided with war credits and with the war effort. It was their position relative to labor itself that caused Lenin to accuse them of chauvinism. Chauvinism is thus closely connected also to revisionism. And this is rooted in a revisionist understanding of capitalism and the class struggle itself. A revisionist, according to Lenin, deviates from historical materialism in the sense that he or she does not take the concerns or the interests of the working class into their priority of analysis. Lukács says, and I think this is a good formula, that the revisionist condemns the dialectic. They work to improve the proletariat within bourgeois society, and they thus refuse to see any revolutionary rupture or break that the system of monopoly capitalism could open up. Monopoly capitalism increases the cost of living. It imposes austerity. It intensifies the contradictions of the domestic class struggle. It fractures the working class. Contra Kautsky, Lenin argued that imperialism cannot produce a more tranquil alternative to itself, and that the fracturing of the class struggle is something that must be taken advantage of by Marxists. This is why Lenin said that monopoly capitalism presents capitalism in its final stage as moribund, and the task is sort of to push it over the cliff. And moreover, within the class struggle, at an ideological level, the bourgeoisie can no longer make an appeal that is at all plausible to its own revolutionary potential, and therefore to its own historical foundation as a revolutionary class. In other words, in the age of imperialism, the proletariat emerges as the only class that can take the revolution to the next level. And as a side point, this is precisely why Lukács argues that Friedrich Nietzsche becomes a prophet of the age of imperialism. Because it was Nietzsche who provided an alternative to a revolutionary philosophy for the bourgeoisie at the precise moment that they no longer had one available, precisely by kind of parasitizing the proletarian movement itself and offering that for the furthering of interests that would be fundamentally anathema or sort of 180 to working class interests. This is how Lukács reads the entirety of Nietzsche's thought in his text called The Destruction of Reason. But to return to Lenin, imperialism has the tendency to create a privileged section amongst the working class. And this privileged section detaches themselves from the main proletarian masses, and they introduced reformist thinking. It is in this context that chauvinism becomes a problem, not only of the intellectuals, but within the class itself. I want to read a quote from Lenin, which I think is very illustrative regarding what his prescription is for a worker facing the fracturing that imperialism brings about within the working class movement. This is the task of the worker, according to Lenin, in What Is to Be Done. To become class conscious, the worker must have a clear picture in his mind of the economic nature and the social and political features of the landlord and the priest, of the high state official and the peasant, of the student and the vagabond. But this clear picture cannot be obtained from a book. When the worker learns from concrete and above all from topical political facts and events to observe every other social class in all the manifestations of its intellectual, ethical, and political life, they learn to apply and practice the materialist analysis and the materialist estimate of all aspects of the life and activity of all classes, strata, and groups of the population. The worker must grasp the meaning of all the catchwords and all the sophisms by which each class and each stratum camouflages its selfish strivings and its real inner workings. The worker must know the strong and weak points of these classes and strata and must understand what interests are reflected by certain institutions and certain laws within them. What I think Lenin's getting at here is the idea that one of the effects of capitalist social relations, and here I don't even think we need the stagist theory of imperialism to articulate this, is that the primary contradiction of capital as a binary locus of struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie does not immediately appear in the sensuous experience of any given worker. Imperialism only obscures this primary contradiction of capital further. Imperialism occludes the centrality of this contradiction by displacing it. As the Italian philosopher Domenico Loserdo argues in his wonderful book, Class Struggles, there are three genuses of the class struggle. First, there is this primary contradiction of capital, which is centered centrifugally around the exploitation of labor. Second, there are colonial struggles, ushered in through imperialism. And third, there are struggles related to the household to women's struggles. These are the primary, in historical Marxism, the primary three, according to Losurdo. Lenin's position is that the proletariat must become primed to transcend the originary, what in the 1844 manuscripts we could call the kind of sensualist paradigm, or exploitation as self-evident paradigm of the class struggle. Here we're presented with the question regarding the necessity of the working class movement to discover the rational means to latch onto a global perspective that is not in the interests of some abstract conception of capitalism or of society in general, which, as we saw before, for Lenin is a hallmark of revisionism, but is rather a global perspective that is operating in the interests of labor. For Losurdo, the very definition of revolutionary class consciousness is found there. In the rational separation between a purely sensory-based conception and experience of lived exploitation of wage labor, this is what we might call a kind of class reductionist position. Imperialism forces class reductionism to come outside of its shell. And in fact, chauvinism, according to Losurdo, occurs when the intellectual refuses to place a trust in the spirit of the people affected by imperialism. And here he even includes Marx and Engels themselves in what he very interestingly refers to as a kind of a moral blind spot of Marx and Engels, precisely regarding Mexico and the idea that, well, it's a bit complicated because the distinction revolves around a proletarian versus a bourgeois revolution. And the reading is that because Mexico had not undergone a true bourgeois revolution, Marx and Engels argued that a revolution could come from outside that would be led by bourgeoisie for the Mexicans. And Losurdo chastises Marx and Engels as falling into a type of error regarding that. I'm very interested to talk about that with my comrades on this panel. What imperialism opens into the class struggle is a struggle also for recognition. And Losurdo argues that this struggle for recognition has a qualitative difference from exploitation of the self-evident paradigm, which I mentioned a moment ago. However, this separation between this kind of struggle for recognition, largely revolving around the struggles of women as well as colonial subjects, compared to the struggle of exploitation of workers, is the task of the Marxist intellectual to fuse, to unite, not to separate those two. In fact, overemphasis on one over the other is the roots of chauvinism, according to Losurdo, which I think is a very excellent point. Now, Moïse Postone offers a strongly contrasting position to what I have just outlined in a 2006 essay entitled History and Helplessness. Here, Postone argues that contemporary anti-imperialism perverts the perspective of capitalism as Marx articulates it. Here he's referring to anti-globalization movement following the Iraq War. For Postone, anti-imperialists bifurcate the class struggle by making it purely subjectivist. Anti-imperialists, in essence, well, what is the problem with them? Anti-imperialists fetishize all forms and all expressions of imperialism through a kind of moral subjectivism, which argues that capitalism is sort of based on a logic of agents. 2 minutes? Based on a logic of agents, not based on impersonal forces of domination. So it loses the capacity for an abstract theory of a dynamic theory of the system of capitalism. Now, Benjamin Studebaker has argued that anti-imperialists today presuppose that the U.S., as an imperial force of empire, is purely a villain, is evil. to express views that are friendly to the US, according to Studebaker's analysis, becomes a sort of quagmire around how the left can adequately connect to the common sense of the working class. The common sense of the working class, in Studebaker's analysis, and I'm getting it from a Substack that you wrote, is completely turned off, in short, since I have limited time, to the anti-imperialist rhetoric of the left. It creates a kind of PMC subculture that is incapable, which I think is an interesting connection actually to Lenin. But in my remaining time, let me say that I define chauvinism as the failure to enable the emergence of a proletarian perspective that would be capable of uniting the interests of labor with other forms of oppression bound up with capitalist exploitation. But this exceeds just the exploitation of wage labor. What Lenin's genius is that he theorized the imperialist age and developed a worker pedagogy that sought to place the proletariat in the driver's seat of the class struggle. Lenin showed that we must shift our perception of the proletariat onto the totality of political and social relations. And in this shift, revolutionary class consciousness must adhere to this shift. I have much more to say, but I think for time, I can hopefully mention it in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay. Platypus seeks to be ahead of the curve of the left, to foresee where the left is going rather than simply to be swept along with it, to tail it. At the same time, our strategy of hosting the conversation on the left means that we're imminent to the dead left, and we submit ourselves to that imminence as a discipline, as a means of experiencing and highlighting for ourselves and hopefully for others the ongoing dialectics of defeat of the left. For the unfolding death of the left is the profoundest truth of our time, which is to say, our time is an ongoing repetition of past times. The repetition of past defeats, of the means of the repetition of past defeats is what passes for historical progress. Here we are called to speak on imperialism, in Washington, D.C. no less. But the American president was just elected on a platform of retreating from imperialism, from ending the war in the Ukraine, something he's presently undertaking. And his very election was sufficient to motivate a ceasefire in Gaza. Trump may not have won in November due to leftists' frustrations with Genocide Joe, but certainly he defeated his rivals for the Republican nomination in 2016, in large part by condemning his party's warmongering. And today, following from that, Trump continues to emphasize peace as the touchstone of his foreign policy. Religious conflict in Palestine and conflict between the West and Russia over influence in the Ukraine and the Black Sea should make us weep. Nothing changes. We are descendants of the 19th century Eastern question. Both issues were particularly hot in the period to which Mike McNair recently compared our time in a platypus panel on imperialism held at the University College in London, namely the 1850s. Both the Palestine and Ukraine questions descend from the decline of the Ottoman Empire and Tsarist aggression. As Marx remarked over 7 quarter centuries ago, whenever the revolutionary hurricane has subsided for a moment, one ever-recurring question is sure to turn up, the eternal Eastern question. The difference, of course, is that we cannot anticipate nor do our circumstances directly issue from any revolutionary hurricane. Still, we experience political ebbs and flows, and we can recognize ourselves plainly in Marx's characterization of the geopolitical crisis that led to the Crimean War. Turkey is the living sore of European legitimacy, the impotency of legitimate monarchical government ever since the French Revolution, has resumed itself in one axiom. The impotency of legitimate monarchical government ever since the first French Revolution has resumed itself in one axiom: keep up the status quo. But Turkey, no more than the rest of the world, remains stationary. And just when the reactionary party has succeeded in restoring, in civilized Europe, what they consider to be the status quo ante, it is perceived that in the meantime, the status quo in Turkey has become very much altered. That new questions, new relations, new interests have sprung up, and that the poor diplomatists have to begin again where they were interrupted by a general earthquake some years before. Keep up the status quo in Turkey. Why, you might as well try to keep up the precise degree of putridity into which the carcass of a dead horse has passed before dissolution is complete. Turkey goes on decaying and will go on decaying as long as the present system of the balance of power and maintenance of the status quo goes on. And in spite of Congresses, protocols, and ultimatums, it will produce its yearly quota of diplomatic difficulties and international squabbles, quite as every other putrid body will supply the neighborhood with a due allowance of carbureted hydrogen and other well-scented gaseous matter. And that, I would say, is a good description of the entire era of the post-war world, and really a good description of American neocolonialism, trying to maintain the status quo. But as I say, Gaza and the Ukraine are Biden's questions, ones that Trump is addressing, so that the left, which itself is always captive to the news cycle, always captive to capitalist politics, is forced to move on from anti-imperialism. In this sense, Platypus is behind the curve in holding this panel. Though perhaps, as Barbara Dorn in our recent London panel recently said, we're living in a period of realignment, apparent because of the US's attempt to annex Greenland and Canada, or maybe we're living in a supposed pivot towards Russia. Supposedly, the U.S. seeks a flow of valuable minerals into American coffers and real estate profits to be drawn from the new Gaza. Fundamentally, Dorn maintained, we're living in an era of inter-imperialist conflict. In this way, we supposedly live in a world in which Lenin's 1916 imperialism pamphlet remains fundamentally relevant. In a broad sense, I would say that the relevance of Lenin lies precisely in its utter and complete irrelevance in contemplating that fact. Presumably then, leftists like Barbara Dorn are waiting for the return of World War I. Here I strongly agree with the spirit of Ben's comments about the need to avoid dreams of war. And like I say, we're not really in the 1850s. The socialist revolution was not just attempted. We're not living in the wake of the revolution of 1848. The revolutionary hurricane is reduced to the incomprehensible whisperings of the ghosts that stalk our social world. The left today is left wondering, did it support the Ukrainian struggle for national self-determination? That is, for the same reason it supports the Palestinians? Isn't Trump an authoritarian and a Russian stooge for demanding an end to that war? Or, more confusing still, might the peace achieved in Gaza put to bed the comfortably familiar Israel-Palestine conflict? Then what would we do? What is unmistakable is that Trump is unleashing an assault against student protesters from overseas. So, surprise, surprise, the left is opposing fascism, if only fascism as expressed in the deportation of an anti-imperialist immigrant. I'm a historian, and whatever it means to say so, a Marxist. I'm trained to see even the subterranean presence of the past. More importantly, I'm trained to take not only the high altitude, but the long view. From that perspective, looking back over the past century of the unfolding death of the left, we can see that anti-imperialism and anti-fascism form a kind of antinomy, a kind of alternating sequence of resistance movements that justify and reinforce the left's ongoing, endless liquidation into protest and advocacy movements. Protesting the fascists, advocating the subordination of the working class to the popular front, protesting the wars, advocating for anti-colonial resistance movements. As Aimé Césaire saw 75 years ago, and he was only, however imperishably, rehearsing long recognized facts on the left or by leftists. Imperialism prepared the way for fascism, no less than fascism provoked the Second Inter-Imperialist War. After all, not only World War I, but World War II was itself an imperialist war, until the Comintern deemed it a people's anti-fascist war in defense of the Soviet worker state. Césaire's protege, Frantz Fanon, was an honorary American anti-racist inspired by Richard Wright in Black Skin, White Masks, and he was an anti-colonial militant in The Wretched of the Earth. Both he and Césaire were conscious of the crisis that this antinomy bespoke. After the definitive collapse of socialism in the core of capital, it could appear that in and through the defeat of fascism, fascism has pervaded world history, and that in and through the defeat of European imperialism, we have revamped imperialism. Rather than skeptically observing our own emotions as we gaze in wonder at the phantasmagoria so gripping, even terrifying, even so manifest, even as it is so manifestly artificial, rather than people gazing at phantasmagoria, as Marx would have it, we're more like people staggering around history in a state of dizziness and nausea, desperately trying to clear our heads and to regain the capacity for experience. We're in the throes of the trauma that produced our disorientation. It's imperialism. No, it's a freedom struggle. It's fascism. No, it's democracy. Or perhaps we shake our heads and realize that everything that has so confused us itself has deeper roots. Perhaps the real problem is the damned Constitution and the American Revolution. Of course, as the Frankfurt School wrote, liberalism is at the root of both fascism and imperialism. Certainly they cannot be understood independently of it, even if liberalism isn't realized or revealed by fascism or imperialism. It's contradicted by them. Anyway, the left is very tired and just wants to rest. Maybe China is making the revolution by taking the capitalist road. Or maybe the third world, yes, there are still people who believe this, will do it for us. In a recent interview with Daniel, Emmanuel Ness made it clear that for him, the entire Western working class as such was an aristocracy of labor. When pressed on the question, he simply stated that all workers in the first world have it better than all workers in the global south, as though that was saying something. He then went on to discuss how Maoists who lamented the Communist parties taking the capitalist road were misguided, because in fact Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping were pursuing, even achieving, socialism in China, despite the fall of the Gang of Four. India, we were told, is the weakest link. But the question of weakest link in what strategy for socialism was, though one might have assumed that the metaphor required it, passed over entirely unaddressed. When the miserable Indian National Congress can't even manage an effective opposition to Modi's BJP, we're meant to believe that somehow revolution is in the offing in, of all places, India. But to recur to them. Bonapartism and imperialism were dialectical concepts, just as Lenin's State and Revolution and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, have to be read together. They point to the necessity and task of the revolution made possible by the split within the socialist workers' movement, by the split within its party. The imperialist state is the dialectical inverse of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Imperialism is the eve of the revolution that will bring about the world dictatorship of the proletariat. It began when the socialist workers' movement itself, in the period 1898 to 1900, began to contemplate capitalism as evolving into socialism, and the workers' movement needed to develop a colonial policy to inherit the colonized territories and people. And that incipient split came out into the open as European social democracy entered its crisis phase from 1914 to 1919. As Lenin remarked in his Imperialism, the split in the labor movement, and by that he meant the politically constituted labor movement. He didn't just mean workers in unions. He meant the Second International. The split in the labor movement is bound up with the objective conditions of imperialism. Both the frankly pacifist and reformist liberalism of the likes of John Hobson and the bourgeois reformism and opportunism of those of the of those in the USPD pointed negatively to the necessity of turning the imperialist war into a civil war. The workers' movement, by virtue of its civil social integration into capitalism, was faced with the question of whether, politically, democratically, it was to administer capitalism, or whether, by virtue of its civil social integration into capitalism, it would seek to win the battle of democracy and thereby create the conditions of possibility for democracy's overcoming. The question of imperialism as the eve of the socialist revolution is expressed in the international split in the whole labor movement having grown evident, as Lenin says. The Mensheviks in Russia, the opponents of the emerging German Revolution, express how precisely socialism, even Marxism, had become the basis of capitalism. As Lenin puts it, reformist Marxism has come to express precisely the parasitism and decay of capitalism, which are characteristic features of its highest stage of development, i.e. imperialism. While the likes of liberal anti-imperialists a la Hobson sought to retreat from imperialism, and Hilferding saw international cartels as pointing towards a global socialization of society, for Kautsky, the war in which the world was engulfed was simply an error. He imagined that social democracy need only survive the war, like a rabbit waiting out the storm under a bush, in order to fall back happily into the old routine once it is over, as Rosa Luxemburg had it. I'll leave it at there.
Hello, I'm here to stand in for Mike Golosh, and I speak for the Progressive Labor Party more generally. Imperialism is about export capital and the organization of cartels such as the IMF, World Bank, OPEC, the EU, etc., to control the world for profit. It's not just a definition, it's going on today. You know, imperialism as it is, and I think that we have to ask ourselves is, why were we just on the cusp of World War? The American capitalists support Israel because it fits with their geopolitical goals of maintaining the petrodollar. The dollar is only as good as the commodities created with our labor, as good as the commodities circulated and bought with the dollar. Since most industry uses oil to make commodities, it is oil that is most important for American imperialists to have it be traded in the dollar. Israel is a handmaiden for Western imperialism. Israel provides a launching pad for imperialist ventures in the Middle East for oil. Israel provides safety for Western goods passing through the Suez Canal and provides another opportunity to build another canal in Israel called the Ben Gurion Canal. Israel divides the Middle East, making it harder for nations with a lot of oil to work together, creating a trust to drive up the cost of oil. The Israeli state has helped out American empire in many ways, even training Latin American death squads, such as the Contras. It was stated by the early Zionists, including Theodore Herzl, that there, in Palestine, we shall be a sector of the wall of Europe against Asia. We shall serve as the outpost of civilization against barbarism. So Israel would be a tool of Western imperialism, so that the West would support their settler colonialist project. To protect Israeli capital, Israel wants to continue its settler colonial project. This project allows Israeli capital to sell the oil off the coast of Gaza or build the Ben Gurion Canal. Iran, not too long ago, was declared by Kamala recently on 60 Minutes interview to be America's greatest enemy. And of course, the Republicans see Iran as the enemy. Of course, Iran is an enemy of Israel, making them more popular in the region because they pretend to care about the Palestinians. But Iran is America's enemy as well, because Iran refuses to trade their oil in the American dollar. And Iran has a smaller, more popular empire that America has to contend with in the Middle East. We have more in common with workers in Iran, Lebanon, or Palestine than the capitalists and their servants in the media telling us to wage war in the Middle East. Iran is close allies with Russia, helping their war machine, providing weapons to Russia, which brings us to our next front of the World War, possible World War. Russia and the USA have been fighting over Ukraine since the fall of the USSR. Even during Soviet times, Western powers have funded fascists in Ukraine. Why are they fighting over Ukraine? Well, there are, according to Lindsey Graham, Ukraine is a gold mine with $12 trillion worth of critical minerals, which the West can't afford to lose. Also, there's plenty of oil and wheat in Ukraine, too. A pro-Western NATO-aligned Ukraine also is a security threat to Russian capitalists, since the Russians share a border with Ukraine. Ukraine's manufacturing is also a desired prize for the capitalist class covets. Ukraine's military manufacturing, Ukraine's manufacturing is more generally geared towards Russian manufacturing, especially Ukraine's military manufacturing that was mentioned a lot in the early days of the war in Ukraine, because it was harder to coordinate with NATO nations who provide weapons that didn't have synergy with Ukrainian military manufacturing. Whereas EU and NATO nations have their own manufacturing tools that are not compatible with Russian, and some of the other former Soviet sphere nations. The Americans in Western Europe actively courted Ukrainian professionals with Russophobia and allowing them to move to Western Europe through the EU. The American imperialists actively funded fascists and NGOs such as the National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA front group in Ukraine too. The NGOs were an important part of this courting. Russia has also courted workers too with cheaper gas prices and their own media outlets. Us communists know better. This courting is just trickery to use us to be exploited by one faction of capital or another. Regardless, whether it's a broken missile treaty, the seizure of Crimea, or the Euromaidan coup, whatever move the capitalists take, it's in their interests, and we workers lose. I think the biggest thing, though, is a lot of times we have to go back to Marxist thesis, the 11th thesis on Feuerbach. You know, the point, philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. We can only stop imperialism with an international global revolution. It can't just be in one area that has been tried. People cannot, we have to spread the revolution. You know, we can't just stop at a certain border and be like, oh, this is too inconvenient for the bureaucrats, you know. Yeah, I'll end there.
So we've now allotted some time for each of the speakers to respond to the statements of the other speakers. We're going to go in the same order, starting with Mr. Studebaker and then going on.
All right, Daniel, can I ask which particular thing are you, did you read which post of mine?
I'll give you the citation. Corbyn, Stein, and the Left's Anti-Imperialism Problem, 2016, October.
Okay. I'm trying to remember which one, because, yeah, that was a while back.
Yeah.
So back in the 10s, I did often make this kind of argument along the lines that, you know, I think that a lot of the time when the language of imperialism gets deployed, its purpose, or at least its function, is to just negate the United States and to run down Americans and Americanness, and that this doesn't tend to be very effective as political language. Back in 2016, I thought we were doing politics. So I thought that there was something to do there in terms of how we would discuss foreign policy, because I thought there was a we that I was part of, that, and I thought we were doing things. I did, but we weren't really doing things. And we certainly aren't doing them now. And that's why I gave a talk that wasn't so focused on that today. And now what I see is a lot of people doing big essentialism and making big sweeping claims about states and peoples and cultures and ethnic groups. And if you push them on it intellectually in a good day, you know, when they're in a good mood, they'll go, well, of course, you know, that's not what I do. Oh, I might have talked like that for them, but that's not what I really think. Oh, yes, of course, I recognize that this is, you know a product of history. But nevertheless, in the practical language, because a lot of people still think they're doing politics, they think that the way to motivate people is by picking sides and bad-mouthing the baddies and upping the goodies. And this has become really culture worry, and it's driven by the turning of the foreign policy discussion into another venue for influencers to make money. That's not really to take a shot at anybody. That's just kind of a clarification of how my view has evolved to a point since that piece that Daniel quoted, which indeed I did write. I also wrote a piece about cautionism. I think a lot of the time in foreign policy we really ought to be asking, is it wise to do that? Is it wise? Because a lot of the things that go really badly wrong in foreign policy don't go badly wrong because they're ill-intentioned. They go wrong because they're foolish and because the people making the decisions are confused. You know, how can you go and create a new kind of polity in Iraq when you've also sworn off from the very beginning the possibility that you would integrate the Iraqis into the United States as your fellow citizens? So your goal in going into Iraq is not to create civil relations with the Iraqis. So you'll go in never intending to make them you. how then will you be able to cooperate with the Iraqis? You're going to politically dominate Iraq while at the same time insisting that you're liberating it. How is that meant to work? The neoconservatives were deeply confused and very foolish. And you don't need some kind of language about how actually somehow secretly this benefits them. It was a great giant waste of money because they had no idea what they were doing, because they were incredibly confused. And a lot of the time, foreign policy decisions are made by confused, barbarized elites that are under a great deal of stress, and they're freaking out. Why did the Russians invade Ukraine? Because they can't get any states to join that Eurasian Union of theirs. And they can't generate any economic growth, and they've been treated like a great big gas station by the Western powers. And when they've tried to create friendlier relations with the EU or friendlier relations with NATO, they've been rebuffed. And they're going, well, how are we supposed to develop? All of the former states, the states that we used to dominate, Poland, Slovenia, Hungary, these states are getting rich, and we're left behind. This isn't fair. But there's no way of including them economically. They have 150 million people. They can't be welcomed into the Western bloc all in one go. Think of how many people would move into Western Europe from Russia were that to happen. Think of what a disaster this would cause politically in the Western European states to have that many immigrants come in that quickly. They barely could manage adding Poland. It put great stress on their system to add Poland, let alone to then go and add Russia. But then what does this leave the Russians to do? How are they supposed to grow or develop? They're always last. They never get to grow. They never get to be the target market for investment and development. It's very frustrating for them. So they go a little crazy because they've been excluded. It's horrible what they then do. But this is how the barbarization works. You go, well, if I'm not part of your thing and you're going to push me around and bully me, then I'm going to think of you as external to me and you as an other that I rebel against. And then you get this kind of conflict, which is very unconstructive and unhelpful, that comes largely out of confusion about what the world really is and what is our relationship to one another. So that's kind of what I am looking to emphasize here. I don't know how much that disagrees with anybody, but I suppose we'll find out.
Amazing. Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's interesting, Benjamin's point about the left's racial world outlook. It's interesting if you look at Marxist theoreticians of the age of imperialism, because that is one of the outcomes of imperialism, which is intense social Darwinistic thinking, relativism, nihilism, despair, depression. Lukács argues that even existentialist philosophies emerge out of the social conditions of imperialism, precisely because imperialism imbues the culture with a profound existential despair and anome, and alienation. And Moïse Postone argues that the New Left, largely responding to imperialism, not necessarily to working class struggle, adopted an existentialist theory of agent-based liberation. And they abandoned this model of exploitation that Marxism sought to put at the center of the left. And that is why anti-imperialism, according to Postone in today's time, is the anti-imperialism of fools. Now, for him, as a Zionist, perhaps, that may be a debate. He's no longer with us, rest in peace. I think his positions on Israel are deeply flawed. But he thinks that that is what leads to anti-Semitism, right, as well, which is this idea that the enemy of the left is basically that the left must align itself as a resistance bloc to fight for the existential survival of subalterns in the global south. Okay? And Postone says that this has nothing to do with a conception of the capitalist world system according to Karl Marx, and that Marx's focus is on an abstract dynamism of social power, not on an agent-based model of social power, okay? And I think that he's right, and given this is my first time at a platypus event, and that the platypus motto, which you see behind me, is really an assault on this existentialist, I would say, new left theory, we have to ask ourselves, in a sober sense, to what extent does that remain true? In other words, is this a reflection, contemporary anti-imperialism, of a kind of fetishized conception of social power? And if so, how can we overcome it while not pandering to real suffering that exists in the global South? And I think that's what my remarks were trying to get at, which I think are like Lenin, like Lukács, and to the chagrin of my comrade Spencer, Losurdo also get at, which is that imperialism presents a conundrum to us in the sense that its oppression extends beyond the primary contradiction of capitalism as the maintenance of wage labor. The function of the state, according to Lenin, is the perpetuation of the system of exploitation of wage labor, primarily. But there also emerges other forms, a heterogeneity of forms of oppression, right? And Marxists, I think, are faced with the real strategic question, which is, do we reduce all forms of social suffering to oppression, and then we arbitrarily excise the repression that is living in these walls, in this institution, you know, the labor that animates all of our sociality where we are? Or, so you see, my point is that Postone has a point that I think we need to take seriously, but where he falls short is that he wants to discard the entire existentialist agent-based theory, and I think that we need to fuse that with a more classical Marxist understanding. I will confess that I think we should be pretty honest regarding the possibility of internationalism, and this goes to some of the points that were made at the end. And I do believe that there should be some type of priority made for figuring out the social reality of working class struggle in the US as a sort of priority for American socialism. And that the institutional mechanisms we have available to achieve and realize such a reality are highly constrained by a kind of paternalistic liberalism, primarily of the Democratic Party, but also of the NGO apparatus. And that further fetishizes, if you like, or further blinds us from actually connecting with and reconstituting, rebuilding a working class that would have the capacity to actually begin to articulate demands for realizing its own dignity. Because one of the things we know is that the liberal institutions that dominate us care nothing, in my opinion, about actually putting the dignity of workers back onto the table. And I think as Marxists, we need to begin there. But when we begin there, that doesn't mean that we negate the qualitatively, in some cases, distinct forms of oppression that are born from imperialism and which are real.
I'm sympathetic with a lot to a lot of what my comrades have said here. I want to, I'll say this, first of all, about Postone. I was his research assistant for the 5 years that led up to that paper that you're referring to, though we had kind of fallen out at that point. I don't think he credits me in any footnote, though he did in previous papers. But I love that paper. And I think what he gets at is, it's not just a question of anti-Semitism, it's a question of the biologization, the physicalization, rendering empirical highly abstract forces of capital in world history. And the leading candidates for that nowadays are things like Europe and white settler colonialism and this kind of concretization of capitalism that really leads people astray. And of course, there's plenty of anti-Semitism going around too. And it is, bound up with the wild overestimation of the crisis in Gaza. The crisis in Gaza is a humanitarian crisis. It's a brutal policy of a very small country that is largely insignificant. Israel is largely insignificant. American imperialism doesn't need it. American imperialism is vastly more powerful because American imperialism is guaranteeing global capitalism, right? There's no enemy, right? There's no enemy to American imperialism. This is why Donald Trump says, I'll talk to anybody, right? I'll negotiate with anybody, because the American empire guarantees world order. It guarantees, as I was implying in my remarks, the preservation of the status quo. Everything that you hate about it, all the mountain of corpses that American imperialism is responsible for in Africa, that British imperialism is responsible for in Asia and in Africa, the whole, of course, American imperialism in Vietnam. It's about preservation of the status quo. Right? It's not an insidious project, right? And of course, it ushers in immense wealth and cooperation. Yes, Mike McNair said at the London panel that immediately preceded this, talked about all of that violence and all of that barbarity, but he said, in the age of American imperialism, America only exports destruction. One would really have a hard time understanding the emergence of hundreds of millions of people from poverty in the age of neoliberalism by thinking in these terms. This is not what what the struggle to overcome capitalism is about, right? We don't have to deny the fact that hundreds of millions of primarily Chinese people have become much wealthier, right? We can celebrate that. Nobody was opposing that. That was the goal. Right? Just as the goal was to reconstitute German capitalism and Japanese capitalism, capitalists have always wanted rich customers. That's the liberal critique of capitalism, going all the way back to Adam Smith and certainly to the Manchester School. Right? Why do they hate the East India Company? Because the East India Company is beggaring India. Right? That's what capitalists think. Right? We can't sell our cloth to such people, right? If we allow these aristocrats to carry on with their idiotic project. So, what do I want to say substantively? More substantively than that. To Benjamin, how relevant is the discussion of ancient Rome? Is it a question of federating peoples? Can we simply divide through the question of socialism, right? Can we federate and create a world government of peace and cooperation amongst peoples without addressing the problem of capitalism, right? That is where I would, and so I would say that your perspective is not only not socialist, it's not liberal. You're not coming to terms with the world historic transformation of the rise of bourgeois society. The entire basis of society has changed since the time of the Roman Empire. And the virtue of peace and cooperation through economic exchange has become generalized. The virtues of war, the virtues of conquest that animated the people of ancient Rome are no longer present. War and conquest is a scandal to everyone in bourgeois society. It's a completely different world that we're living in. even as the capacity for destruction is so much greater. But we're not in bourgeois society either. And it's important to recognize, and this would be my comments to Daniel, and they follow directly from my comments and my prepared remarks, which is that Lenin's notion of imperialism he says imperialism has emerged since 1898. That there's something about the era of the Boer War, of the Spanish-American War, that has changed the world situation. Now, he doesn't think capitalism emerged in 1898. He doesn't think European imperialism emerged in 1898. He knows it didn't. He was around in his youth when Africa was carved up amongst the European powers. He remembers when China conquers Indochina in the 1880s. He knows about the Third Anglo-Burmese War. He's very aware of a deeper history going back into the 1880s, 1870s, and indeed deeper than that into the completion of the conquest of India in the 1850s and the Second Opium War, etc. So, what's he talking about, right? And of course he knows the Adam Smith story about the Iberian empires, the Dutch, the British. He knows all of that, right? Everyone does, right? These were literate people. He's talking about when the question of world governance becomes a question that's splitting the socialist workers' movement in its parties. Right? The era of imperialism is imperialism 2.0, Bonapartism 2.0, when the world is ripe because of the emergence of mass political parties for socialism that count their membership in the millions in European countries and in this country. Right? That he is, and by the way, this text is used as if it's the great license for third worldism in the works of Lenin. It's the most Eurocentric thing he ever wrote because it's all about the splits within the Second International. That's what it's about, right? And the question that he's posing is how those splits are enabling politically the working class to come to terms with its capital problem, right? Because capitalism is ultimately the working class's problem. It's not, you can get rid of the capitalists and it'll still be there, which is exactly his point in State and Revolution, exactly his point against the anarchists. What will you be left with when you have seized state power and you've achieved the dictatorship of the proletariat? The contradiction of bourgeois right, i.e. capital, as the working class's problem, right? So it's the question of negotiating that the split that's also, and of course the crazy, and this is the last thing I'll say, I understand. The last thing I'll say is that from a leftist point of view, World War I is socialism's fault. And Germany started it. Why? Because Germany was to make the revolution. The war is made by the German High Command in order to force the German working class to shit or get off the pot, to either become a basis of the German imperial state or to make the revolution. Right? Rosa Luxemburg says it. Right? It's our fault. It's German social democracy's fault. Right? These are perspectives. This is why I was saying that the relevance of this stuff is to understand how irrelevant it is. Because this is not our world at all. right? We don't have mass political parties for socialism. We're not at the center of the dynamics of world historical change.
I think one thing that we should put in our calculation of the likelihood of revolution is that, like, by 2100, like, Florida is supposedly, like, good portion of it is underwater. And, you know, we can talk about New Orleans. I mean, a lot of the Southwest is also going to be unlivable. But, I mean, the way that I think about revisionism was, you know, I would say a revisionist is someone who falls down the well of electoral politics, as Edward Bernstein did. But, like, also another, like, kind of revisionism is somebody who rejects the possibility of revolution at all. And, you know, has, like, it's not to say that things in the first world have been created in such a way to make many people liberal. But it's, you know, at a certain point, you know, as communists, you know, when are you going to advocate for communism? When are we going to advocate for revolution? Obviously, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but we should be working towards that actively, you know, because that person that might be a little scared of you saying the word communist, they're definitely never going to become a communist if you never tell them, you know, they will never think about it, you know, if you don't even mention it. One of the things I would like to mention, I think, I mean, this society creates a lot of racism and bigotry and stereotypes and lies, you know, anti-Semitism and racism just by its structure. But there are times where the ruling class actively spreads lies about people, and they've been doing that for a very long time. The notion that black people are lazy, that obviously comes from the master, the person who owns slaves. You know, and I think, you know, whether we're talking about anti-Semitism in the early 1900s, where, like, Tsar Nicholas II, like, actively had the military read the Protocols of Zion, or, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, just there's a lot of lies that are actively spread by the ruling class, and we shouldn't let them get off the hook from that. It's not just about the system, how it kneecaps people and makes people look bad or something like that. It's also, there's active lies that are spread in our media.
Thank you all for responding to each other. We're going to have some Q&A now for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. I'll bring the mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists. I really enjoyed this discussion. I wanted to ask about what, Daniel, you once called the generational moment of the millennials. You said it wasn't just the Iraq War, don't let it be forgotten, but it was also Occupy and the Bernie campaign, and we might also add Syriza and Podemos in Europe. And on Platypus's first panel that they ever held in 2006, Danny Postel, which was a panel about imperialism, Danny Postel said imperialism was the air that the Gen X left had breathed, that it was just the natural way of thinking about politics. And he thought that this was a liability for the Gen X left. That, for example, it led them to a kind of uncritical support of figures like Milosevic as, like, anti-American imperialist figures. And he implored the millennials to kind of not fall back into that trap that the Gen X left had fallen into. This was, you know, 2006, after a few years into the anti-Iraq War protest movement. And then we had that generational moment unfolding. We had Occupy, which Bhaskar Sankara looked at and said, this is the millennials getting serious about politics. Perhaps because it somehow seemed not to fall into either sides of the antinomy that you discussed, Spencer, of anti-fascism versus anti-imperialism. Occupy seemed somehow to just be a different subject altogether. And so we went through that whole moment, which Benjamin, you said was it seemed like we were doing politics in 2016. And then that moment of seeming to do politics came to an end. And then the millennial left found itself back with anti-imperialism. And so I wanted to ask, why did that happen? Why did the millennials find themselves compelled back to where they started, which was the thing that supposedly the millennials were trying to overcome? Was there a anti-imperialist-sized blind spot in Occupy or the Sanders campaign? Or were there opportunities in that previous moment that were lost with the turn to anti-imperialism? That's my question.
Which of you would like to answer that first?
I think we're two people at least are implicated in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe Benjamin, then me, and somebody else?
As long as you all are comfortable with that.
Is that okay? Yeah, sure.
I think the short answer to that is the market. The market is the reason that the left talks about imperialism continuously, because the parts of the left that we still see are businesses. They're media businesses that exist on the internet. And they have to talk about whatever it is that gets clicks or advertising revenue or keeps the patrons happy. These are people who are dependent and are not able to think independently or to say what it is that they really think would be best or would be good. And because of this, they very often lead other people astray. While I have the mic, just in reply to one thing Spencer said, I have said many times on platypus panels, I am a non-liberal pluralist. And if you have to be a liberal to be a socialist, then I would be excluded on that definition. I believe in pluralism, and insofar as you understand liberalism to be simply that, you could count me. But I am not a liberal in many other senses. So I am very much committed to pluralism, but I'm also certainly not on the right, because I think that you guys can think. I don't think that I need to dominate you with an esoteric doctrine that I drape in all kinds of confusing gobbledygook. I think that you can think, and I think that our purpose and goal is to create conditions under which more people can realize their potential to think, much more than was ever possible at any previous point in history. So the Romans are, of course, relevant to us, but also not, just as every historical period is relevant to us, but also not. One thing that drives me a little bit crazy about platypus is the arbitrary line that's drawn between the parts of history that are relevant to us and the parts that are not. Because it's not as if the Romans didn't have markets and free labor. It's not as if people didn't take wages in the Roman Empire. It's not as if all of the people who did the work were slaves. My God, what a caricature that would be. And the same is true for Athens, and the same is true for Persia, and the same is true for China and a great many other places. We can't simply exclude all of this stuff and cast it into the bin. These people are our ancestors too. These are our guys too. And these traditions belong to all of us. We don't simply say, oh, those are the aristocratic traditions. They're not ours. They belong to them. We don't touch that stuff. Not until maybe later after socialism when you're ready for it. No, no. This is to be had by us today, and without it today by us, there won't be socialism.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think Ben's right that the institutions of the left have an interest in keeping the left's conception of its own global analysis of the situation through the prism of imperialism. In part, I think this is a tactic of the ruling class that has been around for quite some time as a method of imperialism to placate the domestic class struggle. That takes a myriad of forms. I remember speaking to John Bellamy Foster of the Monthly Review, which is a very famous Marxist current of interpretation, famous for further elaborating the theory of monopoly capitalism. And they have been at the forefront of anti-imperialist Marxism. And Foster has confided to me on my podcast that he has had an interest in actually, maybe not so much neglect, that there has been a neglect of the domestic working class question, but there's also a humility that I think a lot of us on the left should have about the fact that we don't know how, given the constraints of current institutions, to regalvanize a working class struggle. And perhaps, despite all of its Gen X, left populist kind of media baggage, the Occupy moment pointed to a different contradiction other than anti-imperialism. And I take your point that there is something almost muted or weakened as a sort of historical repetition on the left to return to anti-imperialism at moments of defeat as like that which somehow is the locus of our own radicalization, but which we are impotent to change. And I think that anecdotally, at a subjective existential level, going back to my point about the legacy of the New Left, it makes a good deal of sense why middle-class Americans who have stability in production and consumption spheres would see the horrors of what our government does overseas and have that be a side of their own alienation. It's only natural, but it's also a reflection of the exclusion of working-class subjectivity in the constitution and meaning of the left, that labor's not that side of alienation, when I think we should think about how it could be.
I may be the only Gen Xer on the panel. I'll say that what Danny Postel is saying is that Gen X had no political identity, that it was just the aftermath and penumbra of the New Left. And the New Left it resolved itself and liquidated itself in many ways in and through anti-imperialism. Its aspirations to build just to take the American case, to build a socialist party in and through the challenging of the composition of the Democratic Party by knocking its Dixiecrat leg out through the civil rights movement, and thereby creating an opening for a reconstitution of an American socialism, the reconstitution of a genuinely new left. Right? In many ways, that came a cropper, and the integration into the Democratic Party happened through opposition to the Vietnam War, which you can already see in the Sturm und Drang around the Democratic Convention in 1968, and who's going to be the anti-war candidate and all of that. And so Gen X continued that, and we had, Nicaragua, we had sort of, repetitions of the anti-Vietnam War struggle that were on a diminished and fundamentally less serious basis. Why? Why is what is going on in that anti-imperialism? In a more fundamental way, what that liquidation in the Democratic Party over anti-imperialism was about was a repetition of the Communist Party's liquidation into the Democratic Party through the Popular Front, right? It's a deeper history of Stalinism that we see playing out, repeated in the New Left, that Gen X is just inheriting. That goes back into the 30s, right? But certainly in the post-war period, right, what justifies the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union and all of that is decolonization, which, again, astoundingly was dressed up as a revolution. In large measure, the idea that the Europeans were driven out of their colonies is as a historian of European imperialism, is laughable. It's a gentleman's agreement, and they step away. And it's highly dubious whether European imperialism was ever profitable in some general sense to those countries. That's why I invoked the liberal argument. The liberal argument, going back to Adam Smith, going back to the Manchester liberals, is immensely powerful, which is that this is a dead weight. look how much we sell to South America. They're independent. We don't need to control other countries. The Argentinians are much better customers. The Brazilians are much better customers. This argument is made again and again, and it's largely true. So there are other things at work. Now, about the question of liberalism, right? The question of liberalism, as I said, is a question of a vision of history. It's not a political, it's not just like, are you a liberal politically? Right? By liberal, I meant the epochal argument made by the Enlightenment about what it was that was new in Europe, how they understand their newness, and that there was a new form of social life that they called variously commercial society or bourgeois society. And to understand the historical moldability or plasticity of human nature in history, to make an argument like Hegel made about the unfolding of spirit is not a denial of the humanity of our ancestors, right? It's an acknowledgement of our humanity and of its potential, right? Just as we have once been hunters and gatherers, as we have been under slaves under the Pharaoh, and as we have lived in classical society and medieval society and bourgeois society and now in capitalism, still further forms of sociality are possible, right? That doesn't mean that you're uncharitable to the past. Probably, humbly, I might say, I've spent, a decade more than anyone on this panel reading the literature of the pre-modern past, right? I have a master's degree in Sanskrit literature. I know what I'm talking about. Right? I know what it is to commune with other ways of being. And it doesn't mean that you're uncharitable. It is absolutely necessary to understand from a Marxist point of view what the liberals said, right? What Adam Smith said. And what Adam Smith said, and Rousseau said, and Kant said, and Hegel said, is that this is a society based on free labor in a way that the Roman Empire is not based on free labor. Is there freedom? Are there free workers? Are there proletarii? Yes, there are, right? But as Adam Smith says, how many classical writers tell us about the night sounds of Rome being the whimpering of whipped slaves? Right? That's what walking the streets of Rome sounded like, right? And yes, that's a bourgeois story about its own self-emancipation, but it's also ultimately true. And it's part of the story of the overcoming of feudalism in Europe, right? Which they viewed as a slave revolt, right? They thought that the basic social relations of Europe were slavery. Right, and that we were runaway slaves who were coming to London and Paris, right? So that's a story that I think is profoundly central to the understanding of, say, primitive accumulation and how we got here, right? And the last thing I'll say that's really important about it, and this is what we haven't quite talked about, I just alluded to reading State and Revolution side by side with imperialism, which is that the liberal story is one of the subordination of the state to society, right? Of the progressive subordination of the state to society. And that is reversed in the age of imperialism, and that the state emerges out of the contradictions of the society in order to lord over and manage those contradictions, right? So that at the heart of the state are bodies of armed men for Marxists, right? And that expresses the contradiction of liberal imperialism, right? That we don't live in a liberal society, right? We live in a profoundly illiberal society. The cops are unconstitutional. our bourgeois ancestors would have looked at it and said, this is much worse than the redcoats occupying Boston. This is tens of thousands of men with guns occupying every American city in order to manage the crisis of this society, right? That is the meaning of the imperialist state at its core, right? It's a domestic problem.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was about, I guess, the trajectory of the millennial left, which kind of began with like inheriting a Gen X anti-imperialism, and then seemed to aspire to take a route that transcended it through, for example, Occupy or the Sanders campaign, and now has come back to anti-imperialism.
Well, I wouldn't see that there was necessarily that trajectory. I mean, like, the big thing is that people, after the failure of Obama, which, I mean, or success of Obama, because he succeeded in what he did, you know, I think a lot of Democrats went to Bernie Sanders, but I mean, you know, what was I going to say? I was going to say that our society is very racist, and I think that adds to, like, not being able to have a proper analysis of imperialism, and it prevents, you know, trying to organize on a larger scale. I mean, I do see that there were, like, Gen Xers that definitely, like, focused a lot on the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, and then, you know, sided with Milosevic. Unfortunately, that was wrong. But I think it was more of like a fishbowl scenario where the fish just, you know, went around one turn and, you know, we're still back where they were. You know, it wasn't like there wasn't much progress on it. That's what I would say.
More questions? Yes. Can I pass this up to you?
Thank you very much.
Go ahead. If you're really far back, you're going to have to walk up here, and I'll hand you the mic, and you can read it.
Thank you all again for coming and speaking. I was very interested in what Mr. Studebaker was saying at the beginning about the empire haver mindset being one that leads to people who are supposedly within the empire thinking of imperial subjects as being somehow specifically different, and this was something that was elaborated upon by other members of the panel. I was curious to hear what all of you would think about what is, you know, by some corners of the left and especially of the center, what is referred to as Chinese imperialism, where from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, if we take them at their word, which I think is a very valuable perspective, their activities in the in the western part of their country, in Tibet and in Xinjiang, and also in the South China Sea towards Hong Kong and Taiwan. For the Chinese, these are acts of, I guess you could say, national reunification, sort of a bringing in of these places to the Chinese polity. But of course, to other people, these are violent acts of imperialist aggression. And I was, and there's other activities the Chinese undertake too that are sometimes referred to as imperialist aggression, such as their contending with the American and Philippine navies for supremacy in the South China Sea. And so I was curious to hear what you all might make of that. The Chinese perspective, which I think goes to some of Mr. Studebaker's comments, and then the, let's say, the Western cynicism towards that perspective.
Thank you. Anyone raring to answer?
Yes, so China would be the empire in the east, the far, far east, as opposed to the Eastern Roman Empire, which is really still an empire of the West. China has gone through a number of different dynasties, periods. Some of these periods have had wider and more pluralistic notions of what it can mean to be part of China, and in other periods, much more restrictive and more limited notions. And this has been a long-running debate all through Chinese history about what is the distinction, if there is one, between the Han and the barbarian. And there are periods where you will find Chinese emperors who very much think of themselves as not simply Han, but as potentially more than one thing. There are periods where China has an openness to the notion that people who don't speak Han Chinese, people who come from other parts of the territory, could really be part of it. But then there are also periods that are much more closed off with regard to this. And so this is a problem that the Chinese empire has had for an incredibly long time, and it's a problem that has recurred repeatedly in many, many forms. So I would be reluctant to be too final when discussing, because there's such a rich set of traditions in China, not just the Confucian tradition, but a number of different, very rich traditions. And these traditions all have this possibility of continuing to develop going forward and to become different and new things. And the tendency is to make sweeping claims about what China is and to reduce China to one of these tendencies or one of these moments, to say that this is the characteristic Chinese moment and all other moments are just, we don't need to focus too much on that. Like all of these other polities, China has a lot of possibility, much of which is not yet visible necessarily to us. So that would be my point. There is definitely a serious question about the treatment of people who do not speak Han Chinese in China, even historically a question of people in South China who at one point in time were not properly integrated, people who lived around Hong Kong or around Shanghai. But this is nevertheless something that China will continue to work on as long as it exists. And it has existed for as long as we can talk about these things in the West. And it may go on working through these things for a very long time. So that would be my advice, to not take one position and stick too closely to it, even if in one moment it might look like China is just one thing.
I don't have much to say other than anecdotally, by traveling in the region, I do not see, and maybe others would disagree with this, a kind of love and desire for the cultural imperialist exportation of the Chinese way of life to others, which of course is one of the, I think, great symptoms of America, which is we love to do that in an aggressive way, even when we're not intending to be. And so that's very distinct. The absence of cultural direct imperialism, even as a socialist, I would actually want socialism with Chinese characteristics to be a little bit more willing to impose, but I don't see it. It's just a brief anecdote. Otherwise, I'm not qualified to answer that.
I mean, I would say that we have to be a little bit serious about, it's not just the other empire or the East or something like that. It's a much less tolerant society, right? Its domestic policy makes it clear, right? The United States is a society, the United States is the global hegemon because it is the heir to revolutions, to massive earth-shattering revolutions that run much deeper than the Chinese Communist Party's seizure of power after World War II. Much deeper, right? And that's why we're a country of every nationality, right? Every nationality immigrates here. There's no country in the world, there's no people in the world that doesn't know that there are their people in America. Right? There's no people in the world that, in that sense, don't think of themselves as candidate Americans, right? And that is rooted in, as I say, it's rooted in 1776. It's deeply rooted in the Emancipation Proclamation and the 14th Amendment, et cetera, right? so that when you look at the ethnic exclusion of Tibetans and Uyghurs and the South Chinese minorities that Benjamin was talking about, of course, this is a country that's been dealing with it. I mean, after all, a lot of its empires weren't Han, including the last one, right? And Buddhism has played a role in integrating the empire, certainly under the Qing, but also, of course, going deeply back into the domestication of the conquest by Central Asian, basically pastoralist horsemen, right? So its history, of course, is fascinating and it's really important, but they bypass, there's something illiberal about their communist revolution. Right now, of course, American imperialism played on every ethnic divide, and I know that, right? Obviously, the Tibetans have been used as a pawn of the CIA, on and on and on, right? But I guess I would say that all that you're really talking about is the Soviet Union that's gone, right? Because the communist project was much more realized in the Soviet Union in the sense of the nationalities policy, dealing with great Russian chauvinism, right? Actively confronting it, right? The question of drawing in the whole world into the United Soviet Socialist Republic, right? That it is a project of world revolution of all nations. The Chinese Revolution is, in that sense, after fascism, right? It's after the profoundly brutal Japanese occupation. Right? The war in China from 1937 to the revolution is extremely brutalizing. Right? This gets to, I think, a sentiment that Benjamin expressed that I just want to profoundly and more, again, endorse, which is that I think the 20th century shows that war is not the road to socialism. Not in the Soviet Union, not in China, right? Especially now, we have to find a way to build a world socialist project that doesn't bring the world to the brink of war, right? Because it coarsens and degrades society to such an extent, and I think the Chinese state inherits that.
In the late 60s, during the Cultural Revolution, there were people from the mainland who went into Hong Kong to help excite revolution. I don't think that was imperialism. I think that the Chinese experiment, communist experiment, actually got the farthest with the communist project. Starting to build communes on a massive scale, and the 3 free things, which went to the 5 free things and the 7 free things. There was an active project to build communism. Now, obviously, it lost. The bureaucrats won out. But I think that it was the first time that there was a massive struggle against revisionism. And it wasn't just like people talking, like they were seizing arms and stuff like that. It's very hard for me to imagine a pacifistic revolution. That sounds very absurd. Especially when we consider how many, there is a group of people that aren't proletariat, that are not also bourgeois, that often side with reaction, the petit bourgeois. But I guess what I would say back to Chinese imperialism, it's a very real thing. We don't want to play that down. I would be very for if China took Taiwan in the 50s and 60s, but not today. Obviously, that's an imperialist action in the name of finance, in the name of computer chips, etc. I think we need to keep our eye out. It doesn't matter if it's Russian, Chinese, European, or American. We should, say down with imperialism. and up with communism, down with capitalism. And we have to organize in the workplaces. I mean, I'm in a party that has part of a 50-year project to organize in Metro, because if Metro shuts down, then so does DC. But yeah, we can only end Chinese imperialism through a global revolution. You know, I guess that's what I would say. I guess one last thing I would add on is, like, recently, I mean, in the last, like, 5-10 years, China's built a base in Djibouti. So it's very clear that they have a vested interest in Africa, just as Europe does, and America, you know.
Can you say when the bureaucracy took over in the Chinese Revolution, how your party understands that?
It have, like, specifically in '68, they talk about how the left within the CCP, so supposedly Mao, and suppressed the left Red Guards.
Oh.
Yeah.
So this was
But
the
it was-
People's War line. This was like Lin Biao.
I mean, we don't side with Lin Biao either, because, you know, but like there were left Red Guards that were correct at the time.
Any more questions for people? Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you all for your remarks and everything. So the question of China and the sort of ethnic integration question, and as you mentioned, racism as well, and also the question of imperialism necessarily implicates the question of the labor aristocracy, which was also brought up. And I wanted to ask about the consequences of what you all were talking about for organization. I wanted to ask if the labor aristocracy in the present, if we can just take Lenin's concept of the labor aristocracy and apply it to today, is it an obstacle to organizing for socialism? Is racism an obstacle to organizing for socialism? And is there a currently existing anti-imperialist struggle that points to some possibility of socialism in the way that someone like Fanon was brought up, the way he understood the anti-colonial movements as pointing to some possibility for something more than merely an anti-colonial movement. As he said, it was the world of the colonized subject was a Manichaean world where one has to necessarily replace the others and there's no remainder there. So my question is, are these historical categories still present today? In what way are they still present? And what are the concrete political consequences for the way that a potential socialist revolution would play out in the United States? Thank you.
You raised the aristocracy of labor and what would...
Racism, just generally, like, how should we approach racism? Does that change the way that we approach our organizing strategy?
What do you guys say to switching it up and going from the right to the left this time?
I would say that fighting racism and bigotry more general is of the utmost importance when we're fighting capitalism, because it divides the working class. You know, there's this thing called the wage spiral, and if one group, you know, is always habitually on the bottom, the group that makes more is going to have to lower their wages to the wages of the group on the bottom. I think another important part about like bigotry and racism is that workers, all workers don't benefit from racism, that it holds us all back as a collective. It makes society worse. Yeah, I don't know how it would change organizing today versus like in the 60s or something like that. But yeah, it's fundamental. It's important.
I mean, on these categories like labor aristocracy, labor bureaucracy, first of all, these should be distinguished. There's a question of the best paid layers of the working class. And the best paid layers of the working class are not by any means the least revolutionary. When you look at the history of revolutionary movements, this is simply not empirically true. And being highly vulnerable in your position at work might make you fearful and less capable of acting in a revolutionary way or even participating in revolutionary politics at all. Similarly, the fact that the labor movement is creating a labor bureaucracy, right? That you get the Noskas and the Scheidemans and so forth within the German party. This is not simply to be decried. It's an index of the maturity of the movement, right? And it's a political struggle, right? Because the experience of the economic struggle that they are involved in is as all socialists should know, is a school for socialism. And one of the things that you're discovering in your struggle with capital is that ultimately your demands are limited by the fact that the boss has to make a profit, right? That the problem of capitalism is your problem, right? Ultimately, like in Germany, right, these massive cartels and so forth that Lenin is talking about, right, they're dealing with a hugely organized working class, right? That's what they are expressions of, right? And it's a political problem to be to win over people, right? It's not just that if you make this much money or you become a labor bureaucrat, you go to work for the union and you stop working in the factory, that you're reactionary. All these things are they're childish things that people talk about when they're not serious about history or they're not serious about socialism, right? About racism, it really gets to the question of the bourgeois revolution, right? Racism has been overthrown. It was overthrown in 1776, right? There was a wave of abolition unleashed by the American Revolution, creating the free states, right? There was there's no such, these things that you children are told are lies, right? There's no such thing as the black struggle in America, right? There's no such thing as a white history in America. There is no history that isn't integrated in this country with Native Americans, black people, people from all over the world, right? And in the course of trying to pursue their projects of freedom, they have come up against these questions of their division amongst each other, so that you might say that race is a class problem as regards socialism, right? But it's no other kind of problem, right? People aren't different, they don't have more rhythm, they don't have a different culture, they're not another nationality, right? All of this is lunacy cooked up by the American left. Total lunacy, right? African Americans are the most American people you'll ever meet, right? They talk like Americans, their culture is, anything that you might say that is distinctively American about our culture is related to their presence in this land, right? You don't have any communication problems. There's no lack of fluency, right? And so I would say that the left, that the American Revolution, I'll put it that way, the American Revolution as a whole, including its socialist project, is integrationist. Full stop, right? And that's because it's not about a way of life or imposing a culture. Right? It's about a project of revolution. Right? It's about overthrowing this whole way of life and creating new ways of life. Right? So I guess I would say I'm with Eugene Debs. Right? To the black man as a worker, everything. And that means overthrow Jim Crow. Because that's a problem for organizing labor. Right? Racism is a problem for organizing labor. Right? But no, we're not getting into black nationalism. And we don't have to be friends. Right? If you're sore about this or that, right? If you're sore about the bigotry of this person or that person, we still need to be able to organize socialism. We need to be able to organize socialism amongst racist people, amongst Catholics who are bigoted against Protestants, amongst Protestants who are bigoted against Catholics. We cannot create perfect people and then strive for socialism. Right? That's the Democrats' project, right? It's going to be anti-racism forever. No. Right? Let's just, call each other names and institute the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, this goes back to a debate that I had with one of Spencer's close colleagues, one of the founders of Platypus, Chris Catrone, on my podcast, Emancipations, and, we were talking about a very, very prominent black scholar, historian, who's a self-declared Marxist by the name of Gerald Horne. Right. And Chris said, well, Gerald Horne ideologically conceals an old school kind of black nationalism. He may deny it, but if you read between the lines, that's implicit in what he is talking about, kind of an old school identitarianism, and that this pollutes Marxism. This is not Marxism, and therefore we can declare him, just as Lenin declared Kautsky, as outside of Marxism. And my response to Chris was that I don't think we have the institutional power or vehicles available to us to make such firm denunciations, in part because we need to be a little more humble about the dominance of liberal ideology over the left. And it's going to take more work to create a foothold. For example, Spencer's notion that the American Revolution has a deeper locus of significance and meaning than does the Chinese Communist Cultural Revolution or the original Chinese Communist Revolution, that is not anywhere close to the sentiment of the contemporary left. I would argue that in a post-68 milieu, the Chinese Communist Cultural Revolution and all of that is much more in the kind of ideological matrices of how we think of the left, for good and bad. So it's what I'm perhaps a little bit more pragmatic when I think about how to take on questions of anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and the belief system of the left. I have to acknowledge that we are subjectivized into the left through these systems. I admire Platypus for taking such a heterodox position in opposition to all of that status quo thinking. It's healthy. I think this is one of the most healthy tendencies of Platypus. Sometimes things go a little bit too far. I mean, I agree that the integrationist project coming out of the civil rights movement, that American socialism is a part of that. But I also agree with the Hartzian view that American socialism has never fully gotten off the ground. And that American socialism, while it has a tradition, that tradition compared to European socialism is profoundly constrained. And that I take that, therefore, that socialism in America is much more of a virginal project, and always has been. We have a tradition of Debs, we have a tradition of socialism, but we do not have a revolutionary socialist tradition that has achieved serious power in this country. I would say it's been largely marginal. And so I have a lot of differences about how we historically contextualize some of these things. On the labor aristocracy theory, my position on that is that we cannot arrive at a conclusion on it based on the income of workers. We cannot, in other words, arrive on it on a liberal theory of class, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think where we could do so is if we were to have a socialist party, the basis of a labor aristocracy would naturally emerge and then become a practical problem in the context of a struggle. But as an abstract problem, I don't see it as particularly pernicious. If we say that workers in America are tending to be bourgeois individualists, well, of course, that's obvious, right? How does it pose a practical political problem is the question. Is there a anti-colonial struggle today in which the Fanonian Manichaean paradigm is relevant? According to Norman Finkelstein, it is Israel-Palestine. It was a slave revolt. October 7th was a slave revolt, according to the great Norman Finkelstein. I would not want to question him too much on that. I think he actually has a lot of validity to that, in fact. That may surprise you. I think, moreover, that having Palestine as a point of determination for the left, as a point where we don't see it, as Spencer suggests, as some kind of marginal thing that Israel's ultimately inconsequential. No, actually, I think that perhaps one of the only ways to re-galvanize a true strength of the left is not to compromise on Palestine, in fact, given the severity of the oppression that they are facing. So I would push back on that point. But at the same time, unlike many on the left, I think the only means to adequately and truly do that is to break from the Democrats. If Trump is conned by Netanyahu into a re-engagement, that will force the Democrats to get into a battle with the left, which could be productive in the long term for the left in breaking from that paternalistic hold that has just shattered us. We don't want that. We don't want it to come to that. I mean, it is a profound irony that all of these cats with Harvard Kennedy School degrees and diplomats spent months trying to negotiate a ceasefire, and one real estate agent went in there and did it. How in the hell is that possible? And, right?
Trump. Simple answer. One word.
Exactly. Well, I mean, it's something to contemplate. My point being is that we have to take the left and all of its pseudo-radicalism, of its kind of middle strata, sort of middle class provincialism. We have to have a little bit more tolerance with all of that than I think a lot of my platypus comrades have. And I think that Palestine has emerged as a point, and it will remain this way, where the left is making a no compromise position on Palestine. Does that mean that the recognition struggle brings us back to that Fanonian edifice of something that would be capable of discovering a new man through violence or some kind of radical humanistic realization? I'm not a Gazan, I can't know, but I interviewed a Gazan on my show, and that was his contention. His contention is that Fanon still lives in Gaza. Absolutely. So I think this is worth us not cynically discarding as a real possibility.
So I certainly don't think that we can make perfect people. I don't think there's ever been any. But I do think that we need certain kinds of capacities, certain kinds of qualities. And in the old days, they called these virtues. And this was not something limited to martial virtue like courage. Prudence is the ability to decide upon the case, right? You would need prudence to answer the question of whether Daniel's right about Gaza. You'd have to be able to decide whether that's a case that conforms to what he's described or doesn't. And to do that, you'd have to judge the case. It's a kind of wisdom. There are lots of other different virtues that the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and so many different people have all come up with and given names to, many of which have something to do with each other. This capacity that we need, What makes me not a liberal is that I don't think liberalism or capitalism generate these things automatically. Indeed, I think they tend to degrade the institutions and structures that we need to generate these capacities. And platypus is itself a symptom of this degradation. Platypus has to exist because the universities have been degraded. They're no longer capable of producing at scale large numbers of people who can think. Now, there's a reason that the universities have been degraded, and that reason is that the university system has been transformed into a mechanism for producing large numbers of managerial bureaucrats who don't need to be able to think. Indeed, their being able to think is potentially a problem. And this is where I would get into this question about labor aristocracy. I think at this point we have seen the college-educated portion of the U.S. population expand from roughly 5% in 1940 to 20% by 1980, and now to almost 40% today. 40 years ago, they used to talk about an 80-20 problem. It would now be a 60-40 problem. And as the share of the population that's university-educated grows, it becomes possible for university-educated people to think that they are society, and that the questions that concern them concern everyone, when really, in point of fact, they're still not in the majority. And one of the questions that tends to concern university people is Gaza. It tends to concern university people much more than people who don't go. And I think one of the problems with the left is that it has become bound up with the university-educated population's set of concerns, which are themselves barbarized concerns that have come out of a broken and decaying university system. And a consequence of platypus's appendagement to the university system is that it constantly has to waste time talking about these issues in a very unproductive way. And it's possible for someone like Spencer to make a discursive intervention and go, guys, you shouldn't be talking about this thing in this way. Why don't you talk about it in some other way? But because platypus remains as an organizational form dependent upon this decaying liberal structure, it's not able to fully escape from this. It remains imminent to it, as Spencer was saying before. So I think one of our major problems now is that we have two parts of society, a 40% and a 60%. In 10 to 20 years, it could be 50-50, that have very little in the way of social relations with each other, and each has its own racism. The part that doesn't go to college is invited to hate the foreigner, and the part that does go to college is invited to hate those who hate. And each of these becomes a further barrier to social relations across that educational barrier. And this is something that afflicts us and is a problem specifically for us to a much greater degree than it afflicted anybody who was thinking in the 80s, anybody who was thinking in the 60s or the 40s. It's a problem that has only gotten worse. It was bad enough in '68. It was bad enough to give rise to McGovernism and all of that stupid, silly stuff that wasted an enormous amount of time for so many people. It has only gotten worse, and it continues to get worse. It continues to get worse. And there's no telling how much worse it may get, because at this point, for many jobs, having a degree makes you more competitive, just having one. Just having one, whether the degree has anything to do with it or not, because having a degree says, I will submit to the authority of an institution and do what people tell me to do to get a piece of paper so that I can get and keep a good job. It says, I will do whatever it is that you tell me to do so that I can maybe have a chance at a middle-class life. Please, 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 give it to me, please. Which is a way of saying I'm weak and I will be easier to exploit. So there is, I think, a problem there. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that we can abandon the university-educated part of the population. It's a large part of the population. It's a growing part of the population. And to say, oh, they're a labor aristocracy, we have to reject them, would be to wed ourselves to another part of society which is not actually capable of leading and not actually capable of doing anything on its own politically. So this is the trap we're in. We're stuck between two different kinds of politics, neither of which is adequate. And we have increasingly no ability to talk across this at all, to the point where we think that those who are on the other side of it are authoritarians and are like looking to hurt us or something. We're very scared all of a sudden of people who have a different kind of educational background than us. And this is a huge problem, because when you get that scared, then you become very Hobbesian and you start looking for other kinds of solutions that are not appropriate and will not lead us anywhere we want to go.
If you want to respond, feel free.
I had a question. We can probably best for dinner. Yeah, that's okay.
Can I just say one thing?
Okay, I felt like what Benjamin's articulating is kind of like the barriers of class insulation vis-a-vis these bubbles of discourse that are, you're giving us a wonderful class analysis to think that. But my question to you would be, what about the persistence of real oppression in the world, which is acute, to which we have to transcend those bubbles at times, which goes back to your point and my point about Gaza being an exceptional point of an extreme oppression that's undeniable. And I know that the Ivy Leagues will do all of the cynicism that they do regarding it, and even maybe some fetishization of it. But that doesn't take away from the fact of what it is.
Yes, what we have to do with these incredibly horrible things that occur is to get beyond the negation of them and to go, what kind of structures would be necessary to actually change the character of the relations? And the liberal position has tended to be that social relations will be sufficient to change the character of the situations. And the thing that makes me antique is that I think that sometimes political relations are necessary, sometimes as a prerequisite. That's not to say that they're sufficient. That's not to say that that the order always goes one way or the other way. But sometimes you do need political structures to create the conditions under which you can have social relations. And what's going on in debating what can happen with Gaza is a debate about what kind of political structures can permit the kind of social relations that can lead to a lasting peace. And it's something that is being state-led, state-driven. It's not something that can be led by society because the social relations in the territory have been completely and thoroughly annihilated over decades, often purposefully, often by groups which intend, for the purposes of getting their way, to destroy the social relations, to create a situation where force appears as the only option. But this is why I raised empires come from confronting the other as a stranger, in Latin a hostile, and not knowing what to do, and not being able to simply progress to social relations, but having to construct a polity, an order, and having to do that by force. Now, that's not to say that that's the best thing to do, or that I like it, or that I want it, or that I celebrate martial virtue, insofar as in the past it's sometimes been historically involved in doing it. But nevertheless, part of being realistic about how you would actually make peace, how you would actually create conditions where revolution can occur, is to widen your frame a little bit and to consider all of the different ways in which organizations, in which conditions for cooperation are structured, all of the different things that come into it, and to not moralize and say, because this is from a different ideological camp, or it was thought of by someone who comes from a different walk of life or a different part of the world or a different time period, that we have to treat it as less central or less important. And none of that is to take away from the importance of the Platypus Project, which is to understand the liberal theorists, the bourgeois theorists on their own terms, which of course you should, but you shouldn't be limited to that, nor should you assume that what they said was in every case correct.
I'm just going to say one more thing in response to this point, which is that what you're talking about in terms of like all of these traditions and sources of virtue and so forth, it's all been sifted by bourgeois society for centuries. So your vision of the Roman canon, your vision of the Greek canon, of Greek philosophy, it's all been sifted by a very, very long discussion. And if you look at the canon that existed for the pre-modern people, it's utterly different than ours, right? I can tell you as a South Asianist, the Bhagavad Gita isn't an important text. It's not that important. It's supremely important for modern Indians, right? So even the way that the past read the Bible, you can see it in 1,000 different ways, right? So this is why I said to you in Texas, consider Nietzsche's point that Plato and Socrates are bourgeois philosophers for us, right? that if they weren't, we wouldn't care what they said, right? Now, I think the more substantive relative point, it's an interesting discussion, but I think the more substantive relative point to the theme of imperialism is the question of Fanon and decolonization. If you read The Wretched of the Earth, it's a very sad, it's a dirge, and it's a profoundly negative critique of decolonization. It's about how decolonization leads to the creation of a new elite that dominates the people and becomes agents of a new imperialism, and it's about the impossibility of that revolution. That's what it's about. It's a provocation of the question. Over and over again, he's asking the question, is anything possible in the colony without revolution in the core of capital? That's what that text is really about, right? You can wave it around and say, every brother with a gun on a rooftop has read Brother Fanon, right, as they said, but actually people don't read that book. It's a talisman, right? Now, why do we want to repeat this fantasy on a degraded scale with respect to Gaza? Right? It was world historic. Right? It wasn't just about the Algerian War. I mean, it was about Algeria for Fanon. But there was a decolonization of Africa that he was very, very aware of and he's drawing on. Right? He's aware of the deeper decolonization in Asia, from the Philippines to India to Indonesia, and et cetera. Of course, the Vietnam War. So now we have basically a lot of geopolitical nightmares. We have a lot of people who are oppressed, people who are subject to genocide, all over Africa, Burma, right? Kashmir, yes, the Uyghurs in China, right? Certainly to extreme repression. Yes, the Tibetans, right? That is all real, right? Certainly ethnocide, right? When I went to China in 1993, right, the Tibetans, the Tibetan children would tell me how they were not allowed to speak Tibetan in school, right? Of course, there's oppression of people, right? Of course, it's an oppression to not be able to learn in your native language, right? That's an oppression that all kinds of people have to suffer, right? They have to learn in English, God help them, right? Or something else, right? Rather than their native language. All kinds of these problems, but more seriously, they're genocides, they're ethnic wars, they're tribal wars, they're child armies in Africa, right? There's all kinds of brutality in capital. It's not just in Gaza. Right? And none of it's going to galvanize the American working class to build a socialist party. Right? You can make the Fanonian point that it cries out for socialism in the core. It does. It does. Right? The suffering of people all over the world cries out like what we can do here, what we abdicate doing with our stupid leftism, right, is criminal. It's a world historic crime, right? Obviously, it's criminal. It's been criminal for over 100 years, right? Everything that's happened since 1917 was unnecessary. The whole history of it's unnecessary. So the world was ripe for socialism. Like, really, it was. It is, but it's stinking, rotten overripe. Right? And that's where, at this point, I feel like the racism comes from the left. Right? I do just want to say, yeah, if we have sex, we're going to have a baby. Right? We're just one people. It's just one humanity. Right? Like, why isn't that scientific point just enough? Right? And then the question is, where do you stand on this party that I'm building? Right? That's what we need to talk about. right? Really, what are we talking about, right? And this is where like, no quarter to these dumb leftists, right? We just can't give any quarter. We can't. These are not the future. This is not the future, right? These leftists are the obstacle. Yes.
Well, I mean, but the left has a certain hegemony institutionally in the academy, across. I mean, if you say racism comes from the left, I mean, I think there is a sense that, especially as we see the poll numbers regarding Trump's support amongst minorities, there's some truth to that. Or perhaps it's rather that racism as we traditionally knew it during the Fordist period is just become something completely different now. And I think that's true. But how in God's name could you ever convince the existing left to shift themselves ideologically without a good faith engagement of where they are? Where they are. Like, this your position right now seems to me to sort of invite a type of spat adversarial relation. I want to see more of a dialogical engagement. Or is that futile in your view?
I just think that, we need to, they're already doing it, right? They're just buying a puppy and, going in, drifting off into depoliticization. And that's fine. Like, it's not hostility. It's just like, let the depoliticization of these people happen, right? And that's why I want to say they have no answer to Trump, right? They just have no answer to the fact that he's made peace in the Ukraine, right? That that you just, that you just send an American businessman, right? Just send an American businessman. And all of a sudden, like these Europeans, like Putin, Zelensky, these are nobodies. They can't negotiate like these fucking American capitalists can, right? They do it every day, right? They're looking at the reality of an American capitalism. It's like, okay, can you just put your guns down and can we start making some money here, people? Like, for real, right? For real. And it's startling, right? And all the street demonstrations that the left will do, it doesn't matter. Right? We are irrelevant. We're just irrelevant. We didn't get Trump elected. That's why I said, like, calling genocide Joe, it didn't do anything. It didn't do anything, right? The left didn't de-elect Biden. They didn't elect Biden, right? Like, the people that have this conversation about Lenin and the meaning of this, like, we're just irrelevant, right? Please, right? And what would it mean to be relevant, right? It's going to mean that we have to appeal to the raw intelligibility and vitality of humanity in the form of the youth, in the form of workers. It's just year zero, whatever that is, 1815 or 1831 or 1851. Right? It's just start over. That's my view.
I guess one thing that's important is that a lot of times a lot of leftists get on a treadmill of reform, even if it's outside of electoralism. So you'll do a lot of stuff with trade unionist stuff, and people will be like, well, then why do we need to do a revolution? You just got me higher wages. So, it's a balancing act where you're working with these people and showing, okay, we can, not just increase your pension and stuff like that. As workers, we actually make the world. But part of it starts off by getting, workers a little bit more and showing that through the strike or through certain mechanisms, they can get more. Because, I guess at the same time, we have to actively push for revolution. And, we can't just it's very, like, comfort corruption is a real thing. And this is something that's, like, even debated within my party, like, we talk about that stuff. So it's a real question about how do you radicalize people who, might get a little bit more through reforms. A lot of it is organizing internationally, because those reforms are never across the table the same. You know, having chapters, I mean, in my organization, the Progressive Labor Party, we're in Colombia, Tanzania, Canada, Pakistan, etc. But yeah, I think, though, a lot of times the word labor aristocracy is just an excuse to not organize in the first world. That's what I would say. A lot of times it's used to shut down any conversation. I mean, don't let people tell you that there are no, like, poor Americans or poor white people. Like, go to the hollers, go to the ghettos in the cities, go to reservations. There's plenty of poor people there. I mean, obviously that's not always the defining character of radicalization, but yeah, just don't let people tell you otherwise.
No, we have a question. I do have a response, but I'll.
Yeah, and with an eye to the yeah, what? Pardon? Take 2 questions, you say?
Yeah, it's almost 7.
Yeah, with an eye to the clock, if there's, we did start 15 minutes late. Yeah. I think we have time for one more burning question, which is brief, and also brief responses from that, because I do want to end by 7 for respect for everybody's time.
Go ahead. This person here also had a question.
Yeah, is there anyone in the back that I was?
One here, one there.
One here and then 2 back.
Yeah,
2 here.
right here. I thought there was
Just stack 'em?
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. Who would like to go first? Go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's very interesting, a lot of the conversations y'all had and the discussions and topics. But for me, what have been such a part of my own study and like collaborating with others, trying to learn as well, is enabling some type of agency and active like subject for workers to be able to coordinate and make the revolution and such. And I think it's why it's such a burning like unsaid question about what organizing means, and that like it's how workers are able to experience and consider their own social position and their own power as well. And it would transform necessarily if they are able to develop that and create some type of intellectual agency that is collaborative and also practical. That because we all recognize that like the proletariat is this one unit for capital to fulfill itself, that because of surplus value and value production, right? And it's their strike, their refusal to sell their labor. That's usually the fundamental class struggle for them. That the starting point is to increase their wages, make their working conditions better. But we've seen often and often that whenever their means of being able to organize and coordinate and having that experience in that form, they meet limitation and obstacles that they end up creating some type of self-defeatism, where they start apologizing for a lot of their own limits, and that there's these obstacles that they aren't powerful enough to overcome. But I feel like through a lot of the experiences of the German and Russian Revolution, despite all its not to get into everything, but I was wondering how you all thought about, from your experience and like your references, what would you understand as enabling that type of agency for workers to actually have a direct role in politicizing and having a political action?
Thank you.
My question is about the significance of Gaza and Israel. I mean, we're having limitations over free speech, like anti-BDS laws that cost people their jobs. We have a guy with a green card getting deported. I mean, it does seem to be very significant for the U.S. I mean, we have an attack on free speech regarding Palestine, like McCarthyism was for communism. So, could Mr. Leonard elaborate more on the significance of Israel?
Thank you for your question. Because only one of you is named in that, maybe Spencer, you would like to go first?
I mean, the deportation of Mahmoud Khalil it's an outrage. It should be protested. It degrades it degrades our social life in the university. If he's our fellow worker, if he's a professor, if he's a student, it degrades our social life generally. There's going to be a lot of this, right? There's going to be a lot of outrages under Trump. I wouldn't say it's a free speech issue. Mahmoud Khalil will still be able to publish in American newspapers and magazines after he's deported. Right? It's an immigration question. It's a question of immigration law. And our immigration law is going to be a real problem. It's going to be, we're going to see jackbooted thugs breaking into places of education and places of work, demanding that people show their papers and carting them off in a way that, we got to be very, very sure that, if you will, the cameras are on that, right? The degradation of our journalism and so forth is a real issue. Let's hope that these questions are really as publicized as Khalil's case is going to be. I mean, I think Khalil's going to, there's going to be a legal defense fund. And I think what we're going to find is that the state has the right to deport immigrants for any reason. That's what we're going to find out, right? I think it's in the law. And I think the law is an outrage. It needs to be changed. And that means that deportation and other such actions, right, should be disrupted. That immigration hearing should be disrupted. I mean, I'm all for all of it, right? I'm all for all of it. I just don't think that it's going to be the big outrage. Right? The big outrage is going to be taking, Colombians out of the taco truck, which has already happened. There's always already that case in Memphis, right, of ICE agents just busting in and taking people who are sitting there and making meals for other American workers and carting them off, right? And if we had a stronger American labor movement, we wouldn't permit it, right, obviously. So that's what I would say, right, is that, I don't think that Israel-Palestine really raises fundamental issues of free speech. I think the fucking pandemic raised fundamental issues of free speech, right? I think that was just an astounding demonstration. But that was the case around which they started talking about misinformation and disinformation and how the First Amendment's a problem and how we need to get rid of it, right? That was the direct assault on free speech rights. Like I said, Khalil will be able to publish, right? The right of free speech is the right to publish, and he'll continue to be able to publish, right? It's an immigration question. To your question. I would say that the working class emerged as a symptom of the crisis of modern freedom in the 19th century and as the promise of overcoming that crisis of modern freedom in conjunction with a intellectual crisis that generated all sorts of socialism, like Owen, Saint-Simon, Fourier, all of these early heroes of socialism. Their struggle to clarify the meaning of modern thought and the modern revolution in the aftermath of both the defeat of the French Revolution and the Great Reform Bill struggle and the July monarchy struggle in France. I would say that was a material force, right? That struggle ideologically around socialism helped to galvanize the working class as the self-organization of the working class helped to inspire a layer of disaffected bohemian intellectuals, right? What we have now is that ideological project of socialism is utterly discredited and besmirched, and it lies in the gutter because it betrayed itself in a monumental way, right? And so when we organize workers or we do that sort of thing, right, it doesn't feel like it's generating that revolutionary hurricane that Marx talked about, right? That Marx experienced in 1848 when what I quoted from him when he was talking about the Eastern questions and the doldrums, right? It was just misery. The left was utterly defeated. They were in exile. They were being sent to penal colonies in South America or in Algeria, or they were going to America and becoming ranchers, right? Marx thought about going to Texas, right? These people were defeated. And still, he's absolutely certain that the revolution's returning. And guess what? He was right. Right? He was right. By the end of the decade, the American Civil War is sparking revolution around the world, and it culminates in radical Reconstruction and in the Paris Commune. Right? It's another wave of revolution. Of course, the First International is formed in that period. And that defeat, they know, is not final. They know it. And they were right. After Marx and Engels were gone, the revolution got stronger, right? We don't have that faith, which my professors, when I was your age, they used to mockingly say, oh, those dumb, that idiot Marx, he believed in progress. Right? Those 19th century figures, they believed in progress. Well, they knew there was progress. In the form of what? Not in the form of reforms or that the caloric intake had improved, per capita or something like that. I mean, that was happening, right? But that's not what they saw, what they were concerned with. What they were concerned with was the growth of the potential of working people to take in hand the destiny of history. Right? They saw the growth of the capacity and the strength of the organizations of the working class as showing that they were going to be able to put their hands on the rudder of history and steer it. Right? And it was so that the way that Marxists talk about that is the only strength of the workers is their organization. Right? That meant the party, that meant unions, that meant cooperatives, that meant all sorts of things. Right? There's no silver bullet for how to get that back. Yep. Yep.
Okay. I would say...
those are my final comments.
Okay. Yeah, great. Very inspiring. To your question, I spent a lot of time with worker autodidacts working on Marxist books, and I think that it's a shame because, well, it's a blessing and a shame at the same time. Nobody has time to read anymore. I mean, the obvious Zoomer data we are familiar with the decline in literacy, but it's really an issue of time and capital stealing time from us. So a great community that Benjamin and I and Spencer are familiar with has this idea of workers with the earbuds in, where they're listening to podcasts, they're listening to an audible book. And so it's about how one cultivates and crafts a desire for an intellectual emancipation that would be practical for their own subjectivity, which is distinct from what we learn in this place. But it is related to what we learn in this place. It's supplementary. It's fugitive knowledge. Think about it like fugitive knowledge. Worker intellectuals are fugitives, and they always have been. And it's that line of desire that you have to find. And once you have it, it's infinite. It does not stop. And so you just have to find a way to influence others. If you can be somebody that can influence others to find that source, that infinite source, you have set them free. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, great questions. So on the question of the workers and an organization, I thank Daniel for raising the Theory Underground project of the workers with earbuds. This is in part a project which tries to create connections among workers who might be in different kinds of fields, who might be doing different kinds of things. The Socialist Party is a historical organization for creating social relations among workers in different fields who do different kinds of work. Labor organizing, when it doesn't involve social relations across workers engaged in different kinds of work or with different kinds of educational backgrounds, no matter how well you organize in one particular sector, no matter how central you might think that sector is, when push comes to shove, if only the Teamsters are organized, or if only the public school teachers are organized, there will not be enough solidarity from other parts of the economy for anything to occur. And this is the importance of solidarity. But it's something which has to be created at an organizational level. It can't simply be insisted upon as a moral imperative. It doesn't take unless you actually build the conditions for it. With regard to the question about the kicking out of immigrants, we have a major problem right now with the concept of the citizen. We have emptied the concept of the citizen. We don't expect our citizens to have real meaningful capabilities or capacities anymore. And we continuously rationalize that our citizens don't need capacities to be able to be citizens. And at the same time, we are treating our allies, our socii, those with whom we have social relations. This includes people who have been given green cards to stay here. It includes people who are members of states that are integrated into international organizations with us, not just NATO, but the IMF and the World Bank and the WTO. We are treating these people not as our allies or as our socii, but as potentially hostiles. And it's because of our willingness to treat them as potentially hostiles that we're discovering that we can extract things from them. And we can, but only by treating them in that kind of way. And this is the difficulty about settling for having allies or for having friends, for having trade partners. It's not good enough. It doesn't actually produce the kind of cooperation which is really necessary. And so there is a need to have a more muscular notion of citizenship, but also one that's more inclusive at the same time. And to have a real vision for how Europeans, Canadians, Americans, the Chinese could be citizens of something in common. And what that would mean, not simply as a question of liquidating or assimilating the allies into the United States, but what does the United States have to be? What does the world that we build in common have to mean for it to really be the case that when we look at people who live in the countries we trade with and the countries we work with, we don't see them as other? That's a question that socialists who have relied too much on notions of society and trade have repeatedly failed to answer, and for precisely that reason.
Oh, yeah, check.
I mean, part of that enabling should be like actually holding space for communist ideas. You know, obviously it's not easy to work, you know, organizing your workplace, but, you know, like actually being that person that takes the initiative and not just like distributing literature, but like, you know, making your own literature even. I mean, I do want to just say it's important to try to organize, you know, as small and futile as it sometimes feels, and, you know, try to join in a larger organization like the Progressive Labor Party or, you know, the Platypus Society, you know. I think a lot of stuff comes back to just as yourself, you're just an individual, you know. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. So first off, I'd like to give a round of applause to our speakers. Thank you all for coming today and for the lively discussion. It was very enlightening. And thank you all for your questions. While you're leaving, if you are a Georgetown student, there is a sign-up sheet in the back for a newsletter for the Platypus Georgetown and all the events that we host. We have a reading group every week. This week we are reading Imperialism by Lenin on Thursday. It is in New North 202 is the room.
You don't have to be a Georgetown student to sign up.
Yeah, you don't have to be a Georgetown student to sign up. There is a place just for your email. Ideally, you should be in DC, but you don't have to be as well. Yeah, we host a coffee break at Georgetown in the ICC every Friday. And yeah. What time is the coffee break? 5 p.m. Yeah, it's in the foyer. So if you walk in, you'll normally see us. And we make announcements about changes of venue on the email list. Thank you all for coming.